Just pain, no grain. This week, Russia pulled out of the UN and Turkey brokered grain deal, a deal that allowed a safe passage of grain shipments from Ukraine, one of the world's largest exporters of the commodity. The deal expired on Monday, and Russia opted not to rejoin, citing Western sanctions on the state agricultural bank causing harm to its own food exports. On the same day, one of the main bridges connecting Crimea with mainland Russia was partially destroyed by a Ukrainian strike. In turn, Russia has attacked the Ukrainian port cities of McAuliffe and Odessa for 3 days straight, destroying millions of dollars worth of grain supply and injuring dozens. Subsequently, wheat prices have soared, leading to potentially another global food crisis, reminiscent of the start of the war before the grain deal was finalized. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, fresh off his Lithuanian visit to garner further support from NATO allies, has accused Russia of targeting vulnerable countries, such as sub-Saharan nations suffering droughts who rely on Ukrainian grain, whilst Russian President Vladimir Putin has accused the West of using the grain deal to politically blackmail Russia. But was Russia right to stand firm and not renew the grain deal? With Ukraine strengthening global alliances, is Russia harming its own by driving up prices of commodities? With this, compounded by a slow counteroffensive, is Ukraine losing its grip on the war? What's next for the Russia-Ukraine war?
Okay, gentlemen, let's get to it. What is next for the Russia-Ukraine war? As always, we begin with our quick fire round, 30 seconds each to lay out your initial stance on the matter, and we'll pick up the conversation from there. So, Tuomas Malinen, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds are on, sir.
Well, I think that the war is now entering the most dangerous phase thus far, because Russian military seems to be rather capable, while the NATO is getting rather desperate. So we are in a dangerous phase now, or entering one.
Mary McAuliffe, your thoughts?
I agree that the coming weeks and months will likely be very, I don't want to say decisive in the war to come, but they will be incredibly important, especially for the Ukrainian counteroffensive if they do want to succeed and try and push forward on new territory. The fighting window and the fighting season is quickly closing. And so far, I think it's fair to say that Ukraine has not made as many gains as it hoped to have made by this time. So we're likely to see fighting continue, especially in some of the areas that we've seen Ukraine pushing forward in, including here in Donetsk.
Last but not least, Dr. Boris Morozov, your take.
I actually don't think that in the nearest future there will be some kind of major changes. I think that neither side has enough forces for a strong attack and for capturing a lot of lands. There are too many mines on their way. So I don't think that the situation will change dramatically in the nearest future.
Yeah, seems to be a war of attrition of sort. Dear panelists, let's feel free to interact from this point onwards to freely engage in a conversation. I do want to circle back to the aftermath of the NATO summit. Was it a letdown? Was NATO wrong not to let Ukraine in, Mr. Malinen?
No, I think it was the forced kind of decision. There's like I would say the excess supplies of NATO have been dwindling for a while, and taking Ukraine into the NATO would have probably caused a World War III. So I think the NATO just did. It slowly walked back on its promises, kind of stealth walking back. I think the NATO leaders have made a catastrophic mistake on assuming that the Russian military would collapse. We Finns know very well that that rarely happens, and the NATO leaders have walked into that trap yet again.
Dr. Morozov, if you wanted to chime in, please.
Look, first, I just didn't hear the first part of my colleague's statement, but I can tell you that as far as I'm concerned, that was quite logical then, basically the decision of the summit, because actually NATO couldn't do anything else, because there were no chances for Ukraine to join NATO on this stage of the campaign. And as far as the perspectives of the war, I think that I would put a bet on a kind of peaceful solution, because it looks like all the sides are getting tired. Europe is getting tired, US is getting tired, Russia is getting tired with all these mutinies and so on, and not always, let's say, the views of the Russian military men, which are a little bit against the Minister of Defense. So, and also Ukraine is losing its people. So I think that the future is freezing this conflict on certain stage.
Mary McAuliffe, is the failure, quote unquote, for the Ukrainian NATO bid, quote unquote, Zelensky diplomatic failure? Or perhaps a failure of setting the bar so high, Mary?
I think
Zelensky failed in the sense of trying to say that Ukraine would be admitted to NATO while involved in an active conflict. I think this is just against everything NATO member countries in the bylaws of NATO. It was just an unreasonable goal. So to push this campaign so forward, I do think it set himself up for failure, for diplomatic failure. But I don't think really anybody actually expected that Ukraine would be led into NATO at this summit. We've heard a lot of promises from European partners saying that they will do what they can to allow Ukraine in at some point in the future, but nobody said it would be while this war is ongoing.
I do want to stay on the topic of Zelensky, because for the first time in a long while, we are hearing some domestic Ukrainian criticism against the president. Should Ukraine get fresh blood into the leadership, or is it too risky to shake the boat at this point in time, Mr. Malinen?
Well, I think that the problem here now is that Ukraine is already a failed state. If we make a realistic assumption on the losses, they are quite massive, way past 100,000 men dead. Infrastructure is gone, and I don't really think that the change in leadership would do much good, because we know from several sources, credible sources, that Ukraine was ready to enter into a ceasefire agreement already in March past year, which was then kind of bullied by United Kingdom and United States, or their current administrations, to continue the war. So I think Zelensky is becoming a kind of a martyr of the ambitions of the current European US leaders.
Dr. Morozov, do you agree? Is it not a pure Ukrainian ambition to keep on fighting?
Not sure. I think that actually the previous agreement, which was more or less discussed, was ruined because of Bucha situation. When all these corpses were found, basically there was no idea to discuss anything else. So this is why it all stopped. But in a way, I do agree that actually without support from Europe and US, Ukraine wouldn't stand.
Mary, let's call a spade a spade. Is the counteroffensive going well enough?
Well enough, I would say most likely not. I think due to the delayed nature of when the counteroffensive began, the fact that the media, the world have been talking about this counteroffensive for months ahead of time. There were many, many expectations put on what this counteroffensive was actually going to deliver. And I think those were unrealistic expectations. I think everybody here on the ground knew that it was going to be a very difficult fight. As one of the colleagues mentioned earlier, much of Ukraine is mined. Some 40% of Ukrainian territory is mined. This means it's incredibly slow going for any of the units here who are working. I'm staying with a unit who's been working in Avdiivka for months, and they've just been holding defensive lines. But any of the storm or assault units who are trying to go out, every single attempt to push further past lines that they've been at for months is halted while they have to wait for engineers, while they have to wait for sappers to come in.
Wow.
And that's assuming that they can get to the mines ahead of time and know they're there, versus how many lives and how many tanks and how many vehicles have simply been lost by the many, many miles of mine territory in this country. So it is certainly slow going, but I do think that Ukraine knew it was going to be slow going, and it knew it was going to be a very, very difficult fight, which is why they have been asking for so much time for all of these weapons And I think many Ukrainians are a bit disappointed by the slowness it's taken for some of these weapons to actually get here. We're seeing pledges coming out now to do more weapons to Ukraine that they would have liked these months ago, and that would have certainly made a bigger difference on the ground.
So Mr. Malinen, to that point exactly, we're just hearing from Mary McAuliffe. Should NATO have armed Ukraine sooner? Is it the build-up that somewhat set the quote-unquote failure or letdown both on the diplomatic front and on the battlefield?
Well, when the conflict or the war began, well, I was first very sympathetic for the Ukraine, efforts as a Finn. That once more Russia is invading a neighboring country, but the longer the war drag on, I started to have my suspicions of why is the war taking so long, because it seems that Russia first got what it wanted, the land bridge to Crimea and most of the Donbas region, and then it just continued. And there was no peace negotiation, no truce, nothing really. Oh, there was negotiation, but nothing was agreed on. And then it seems to me that what I heard for example, from Professor Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University in a conference lately, is that it was especially the promises of military support to Ukraine which toppled the deal in March 2022. So, and the thing is that Ukraine had quite a big army to begin with, but it just couldn't match the the on-ground strategic implementation of the Russian forces. And I think at this point, putting more NATO forces on the ground would not create anything good. So I don't think there's no quick and easy solution except just a truce to this at this point.
So it was hope or false hope that brought about this hopeless situation, if I understand you correctly. Dr. Morozov, before we take a break, wrap it up for us.
Let's go back to 2014. Then Russia was really controlling the situation with the open border of Ukraine and getting its militant people in Donetsk and Lugansk. Now everything is vice versa. The whole Ukraine is against Russia, like previously Lugansk and Donetsk, and US and Europe are trying to control the situation.
And on that note, Mary McAuliffe, Tuomas Malinen, and Dr. Boris Morozov, we are taking a very quick break, but when we get back, we unpack the grain deal aftermath or leg thereof. So do not go anywhere, a few minutes, and we're back. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Dr. Boris Morozov, Tuomas Malinen, and Mary McAuliffe. Thank you all very much for staying with us. We're also staying on topic, of course, but before we get back to our conversation, post-grain deal, wheat's at stake, excuse my pun, for the world and for Russia. Let's take a listen to what Russian President Vladimir Putin had to say.
We've been extending this deal time and again, and doing so we showed miracles of restraint and patience and tolerance. We expected that our international colleagues would finally start to fully observe and agree approved parameters and conditions. However, this was not the case. The West used the grain deal to profiteer shamelessly. They simply and fully distorted the meaning and essence of these agreements. I will remind you, initially, the deal was aimed to safeguard the global food security, decrease the threats of hunger, and support the poorest countries of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. This was why Russia has committed itself to promote its fulfillment.
So let's get to it. Another quick fire round, 30 seconds each. Is the West blackmailing Russia over the grain deal? Mary McAuliffe, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds are on.
I actually think a more accurate question would be, is Russia blackmailing the West and the global food supply over this grain deal? This is a deal that was reached for humanitarian purposes to supply grain to much of the world's food supply countries who needed it most, including developing countries. 65% of the Ukrainian exports since this deal have been reached have gone to developing countries, either indirectly or directly through foodstuffs. And it's once again another attempt by Russia to try and put their own conditions on a deal.
Dr. Boris Morozov, your thoughts?
I fully agree I fully agree with our colleague. I think that Russia is blackmailing the West regarding this deal. And what I'm surprised is why it was done now, because on the 27th, 28th July, as far as I remember, there will be the African-Russia summit in St. Petersburg. So I'm really surprised they decided to announce it now and not in a week time.
Tuomas Malinen, last but not least, perhaps you have the answer to this question?
Well, I think that it's a failure of politics on both sides. Global food market is just way too important to be used like this, but it seems that it has become a massive pawn in this kind of a battle between the East and West here. So as an economist, I do worry about the fate of the global food market here.
And to that point exactly, and please feel free to interact from this point onwards. Kenya calling Russia's grain axing stab in the back for all drought-hit countries. Turkey still has some leverage vis-a-vis Russia to get it back on. Is it really the end of the road for the grain deal? Is Moscow picking up, making new enemies for no good reason, Dr. Morozov?
No, I don't think this is definitely the dead end, because only today Putin announced that actually they are not principally against the grain deal. They just want the conditions to be fulfilled. And their main idea is that the Russian side of the conditions are to be fulfilled, meaning that Russian grain is also to be the part of the deal. It has to freely go wherever it has to go. Also that ships are to be protected, to be insured, and so on and so forth. So I think that on this condition they are ready to prolong it.
Mr. Malinen.
Yeah, back in 2014, I was a big supporter of the sanctions against Russia, but a year in or so, we already knew that they had rather failed. So Russia had just become food dependent. And I think the whole idea of sanctions here, we should acknowledge that they have failed to deliver on both sides actually what they should have been. So I think we should, all the parties should go into a negotiating table now, and the situation in Ukraine should not dominate the global food supply, and the sanctions do not work. And as a Finn, I have to add this. I've been saying all along that I am much less worried of a integrated Russia than an independent Russia. And we're pushing them to be more independent, and thus, I think, more dangerous.
Interesting. And perhaps to that point, Mary McAuliffe, the MI6 chief, is saying that Putin cut a deal with Wagner to save his skin, end quote. Is Putin's leadership still under threat? Is it out of danger?
Yeah,
I wouldn't say it's out of danger.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
I wouldn't say it's necessarily out of danger. I think there are a lot of clearly domestic problems in Russia, many also stemming from this war, and there has certainly been pressure on Vladimir Putin. This pressure is likely to continue, whether it is coming from Wagner or whether it is coming from some other political entity in Russia. We don't really know. The whole...
Yeah, we're having some technical difficulties.
Very suspect.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, Mary, please keep on going. We had that technical difficulty there. Yeah.
I think Vladimir Putin is very aware that he is in a situation in which he has to tread carefully. And I think we can see him taking maybe dramatic steps because he is feeling some kind of pressure, perhaps whether it's internally or coming from international actors. It is likely that he's also feeling somewhat pressured or somewhat at odds with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan for recent moves, including one at the NATO summit. Erdogan agreed to allow Sweden to join. This is at odds with Putin's policy and Putin's thoughts on this. Also returning a number of Ukrainian commanders who were released under this prisoner swap agreement under the guise that they had to remain in Turkey. And those commanders recently returned to Ukraine. So we have seen tension building between Putin and Erdogan. That's not to say it's the end of their friendship. They have a very, very strong relationship. So it is possible that all of this is just coming as some big diplomatic ploy, and for Vladimir Putin to try and relieve some of the pressure on him by reapplying pressure in turn and trying to get his own relief in some way that he can see it.
Right, and also Putin announcing officially he will not be attending the BRICS summit in South Africa because of the pending ICC arrest warrant against him. Mr. Malinen, you wanted to chime in.
Yeah, just one thing I wanted to add is that according to my sources in Russia, it's actually the support for the war and Putin has grown. And what went kind of wrong in the Prigozhin or Wagner coup attempt, I think it was real. That's my thinking of it. But it kind of showed it pushed many Russians together. So once again, it's my worry that we are actually making Russia more strong here with all these different acts. Russians are coming together, according to my sources at least, in a way which have not been seen for a while. And this is something we don't speak about. These are worrying trends.
Dr. Morozov, what do you think?
I'm not sure Russia is becoming more and more strong, because Russia is also spending its forces and its weapons and so on. But for sure, Russia is also studying its lessons in this war. And yes, for sure, it's studying how to deal with all the sanctions. About the sanctions, I fully agree with my colleague that actually sanctions didn't reach any goal on both sides. So, yeah, in a way, it made Russia more economically independent, I would say.
And Dr. Morozov, briefly, before we need to conclude our conversation, Prigozhin, Wagner chief, making a public appearance. No more Ukraine for Wagner mercenaries, and dubbing the situation at the battlefield a disgrace. Does Russia stand any chance in the battlefield?
Look, actually, according to, let's say, certain calculations, there were from 25 to 30,000 mercenaries of Prigozhin, and only 1,000, 2,500 went with him to Belarus until now. So basically all others are either dismissed, which I seriously doubt, or just entered the Russian army in other, let's say, military units. So I don't think that there is a tremendous loss.
Well, sounds that we're more or less in the very same situation as said at the opening of our conversation. A war of attrition at some sort, and the ending appears to be only at the negotiation table. Hey, I see you liked it. Want more? Just hit the subscribe button right here. Go on. I know you want to.